Hey yo, I'm Will and I've been drawing for a bajillion years, so today I decided to share my drawing process for this artwork. Strap in and I'll show you. Since this is supposed to be a big fancy splash art to flex with, I start off doodling post thumbnails, keeping in mind the features of the characters I want to show off. In this case, the character is Boothill from Honkai Star Rail, who is a cowboy, so I wanted to have him aiming with his gun, while the focus is on his face with his long hair waving in the wind. So I doodled some concepts with him aiming towards the camera with a lot of foreshortening. I sketched multiple of these so I can pick out the ones that look the coolest, instead of just using the first pose to come to my mind. I liked the last two the most, though the last one was more focused on his boot than his face, which I didn't want for this specific artwork, but I'll be keeping that pose in mind if I feel like making another Boothill fan art in the future. In the sketching phase, I take the thumbnail and make it bigger to sketch on top of it. The anatomy in the thumbnail was very loose, so the rough sketch is where I start to refine it. The idea for this artwork is that the character is holding onto an advertisement board on a skyscraper and aiming below, so the camera is actually looking up into the sky. To make this pose less difficult to draw, I put on a cowboy hat, got out a toy revolver, and took reference pictures of myself, which I will not share because they are very silly. But yeah, references can be super helpful, especially when it comes to anatomy, and even more when it comes to foreshortening. Honestly, the way I learned to do it was through references, and just not caring if it looks a bit wonky, because honestly, if you look at any drawing that has foreshortening, it's gonna look slightly weird the longer you look at it. As for the gun, in this case I was very lucky because I could screenshot Boothill in-game and literally copy-paste the gun at the right angle. Work smarter, not harder, guys. No, but for real, I hate drawing geometrical objects, especially if they're this complex and in this funky-ass perspective. But there's no shame in tracing it since it doesn't cover the majority of the artwork, to be honest. And then I put another sketch on top of the sketch because the first one wasn't clean enough for me yet. I want to do very crisp, thin line art for this, which is harder to do if my sketch is too loose. Drawing faces at this angle is not easy, so if you're struggling with this, I'd also recommend taking pictures of your own face at the angle you want to draw, or if that's still too difficult, which understandable, you know, faces are hard, you can use free 3D models with very simplified faces, like in Clip Studio for example. But I like drawing this angle, so at this point I've gotten the hang of it without reference. I define his clothing, hair, and YouTube, these are robot bobas. He's not naked. Kind of, I guess. To spice up the composition, I add some strands of hair moving in the wind, and then it's time to figure out what the fork to do with the background. I already mentioned he's hanging off a skyscraper, which meant that I would need a perspective grid. Yay! In Procreate and Clip Studio, you can just add them to your canvas and make certain layers snap to it. This is super handy for drawing environments with a lot of architecture, like tall fudging buildings. I took some screenshots of locations from in-game as inspiration, deciding to go with more skyscrapers with big billboards, and a funky roller coaster going in between the buildings to add some character to it. Line art time! I actually enjoy doing line art. I used to hate it, but now it's nice because I can kind of just turn my brain off and just follow the forms I laid out in the sketch. I set my sketch to a very low opacity so I can see my line art well. I've heard a lot of people don't like their line art after they turn off their sketch layer, and it could be because their sketch layer was on a higher opacity, which makes it harder to see what the line art actually looks like. So if that's something you struggle with, maybe try lowering the opacity of the sketch. The brush I use for line art is actually the same one I use for sketching, just smaller. I have presets on my brush size slider in Procreate, so I can easily swap between the sizes I use most often. The middle preset I used for almost all of the line art in this one. The bigger one I mainly use for the thicker lines on the arm, hand, and gun, and the smaller preset was used for the arm that's facing away from the camera. This way, objects closer to the camera have thicker lines to draw more attention, and objects further away have thinner lines. I also kept the gun hand, body, and backhand on separate layers in case I want to apply special effects like blur to them later to convey depth. I added the cape and hair behind him without line art because it was easier to add those with the lasso tool. Yeehaw! We're so on theme today.
listening to Silk Radio.
Oh boy, the colors. First of all, I give each of the Lineart layers a flat color layer in dark gray, which I then clip all of the other layers onto. Then I drag and drop the colors into place using my Lineart as the reference layer. This only works if your Lineart is clean enough, especially in Procreate. Since I used very thin lines in some places, I also had to go back in and fix up some parts manually. I'm eyeballing the colors I pick, and each color gets its own layer, so I can adjust them easily later. Then I quickly put down flats for the main background objects, aka the big ass buildings Boot Hill is in front of, with the advertisement sign and the other buildings that take up a good chunk of the canvas behind them. I'm not a fan of drawing architecture, but sometimes sacrifices have to be made for your favorite characters. To make my life easier, I used the perspective grid, which I mentioned earlier, and the super handy city and window brushes I downloaded for free. The rest I leave for Future Will to worry about, which I'm sure he will appreciate. Future Will here to announce that you can now get prints of my art on InPrint, including the very Boot Hill artwork you've been watching me make. The website currently has a sale going on that also applies to my work, so grab it before the sale ends. Also, if there's any other artworks of mine you'd like to have as a print, let me know and I will add them. For shading, I'm one of those people who shade each color individually, as opposed to going over all of them at the same time with a multiply layer or a similar layer type. It can be a bit tedious, but I like to work this way because first of all I can lock the layer, so all the shadows I'm painting on the jacket stay on the jacket without me having to select the jacket every single time. And also I find it looks more interesting to shade each color differently. When you use a multiply or add layer, for example, it kind of puts the same tone over everything, which can be great to unify them, but it can also look kind of bland. Whereas with the way I do it, I can make sure the white parts of the hair get tinted blue shadows, while the face gets more desaturated red shadows. And also different surfaces reflect light differently, so for the metal parts on Boot Hill's body, the highlights are a lot brighter than on her jacket, for example. The shading on his skin is pretty simple. I added some shadows to the parts of his face that are turned downwards and blended some of the edges. Honestly, the real magic here comes from knowing where to place the shadows, which took me a while to learn, but once you figure that out, the rest is pretty easy. I add some highlights in a desaturated bluish tone to contrast the skin, and also add a slightly lighter but more saturated orange on the shadow layer with an airbrush to give it that subtle translucent look that real life skin has when it's being hit by harsh light. And to finish up the skin, I add a slightly darker shadow and also add shadows cast from his hair strands. Boot Hill has very cool looking crosshair eyes, but what I love the most about them is how the gray contrasts with the bright red pupil. It's a very intense look. I slap a highlight on top with some chromatic aberration and his face is done. For now. To shade clothing that has folds, I like to use two different techniques. One is using my round brush that has 100% opacity, laying down the shape of the fold and then blending it with the blending tool. And the second one is using the selection tool, selecting the fold area and then going over it with an airbrush. This way I can get a nice mix of hard and soft edges, which gives you this more realistic rendering style as opposed to cel shading. For very vibrant colors, it can look really cool if you use a desaturated version of the color as the base and then paint the parts that are not in the shadow on top using a brighter, more saturated version of the color. That just really makes it pop, and I especially love doing this with red. It's one of my favorite colors to shade, to be honest. I also added a more purple tone in the parts that are even more in the shadows. This drawing also has a lot of metal parts, so let's get to it. To shade the gun, I use a similar technique as with the clothing folds, aka the selection tool and soft airbrush. Metal can have many soft gradients on it, so I like to start with those before making it look more reflective. I make sure the front and top of the gun are lighter than the side and bottom so it looks 3D. Sometimes if I'm not happy with the contrast on a layer because it looks too flat, I will use the curve tool to adjust it. However, that tends to saturate the colors more, so I have to go back in and desaturate them again. If you work in a program that has a contrast slider, that might work easier for you, but unfortunately I don't. Now it's time to make it look shiny. What makes metal look so reflective is the fact that it reflects the environment around it, so it will often have a lot of contrast and sharp lines. But since the background isn't finished yet, I go with some browns to match the gold color of the gun for now. I mainly use my flat round brush again to draw in sharp lines, where the barrel has edges or round planes. Honestly, shading detailed metal objects like this takes a while. we will come back to it later. At this point I needed some hype, so I posted the work in progress on my Instagram. And what did Mari send me?
For a bullet, waiting in line for a bullet, waiting in line for a bullet, waiting in line for a bullet, for a bullet, waiting in line for a bullet, waiting in line for a bullet, waiting in line for a bullet.
I know, you all wanted to see Minecraft Horse Boothole too. No need to thank me. Now back to the artwork. Remember when I said I left the background for Future World to worry about? Well, Future World was not happy about this. But oh well, someone's gonna have to suffer through this, and I guess it's me. I imagine that the gap between the building Boothole is in front of and the other buildings is an important street with lots of lights, so the buildings are lit up on the side facing that street and mostly dark on the side facing away. But since the buildings have windows and they're made out of glass, the windows on the darker side still reflect some of that light. At this point I noticed that the color scheme wasn't really what I had in mind for this artwork yet, so I messed around on another canvas and realized I wanted it to be nighttime. So I changed the sky to be darker and a little bit cloudy, and also made the buildings darker. There's also more buildings in the sky because why the heck not? It was a bit hard to tell Boothole was hanging off a skyscraper at this point, so I wanted to make the windows on that building reflect the area around it more clearly. I added more skyscrapers with lit up windows in the reflection, but here comes the genius move that I think really made it better. I copy pasted Boothole, squished him down a bit and made it look like the building is reflecting his back. Back to Boothole himself though, because he did not look like he's part of the scene yet. I added a hard light layer on top of his colors to shift everything to a more blue-purple tone, like the rest of the artwork, and then went on top with another hard light layer to add the light coming from the advertisement sign above. Fun fact, the sign is an actual word and not just gibberish. Then I added another hard light layer to make his metal body and jacket pop more. I don't know if you could tell, but I really love hard light layers. Now that we have the background pretty much done, I can continue with the gun. By the way, if you guys would like to see the full unedited time-lapse of this artwork, it will be up on my Patreon. It's half an hour long and I have some actual speed paint footage for this one as well, which I think is half an hour long on its own. Anyways, lots of footage for this one. I decided to merge all the gun layers together so I could properly shade on top of the line art as well. To make the metal even more edible, I added in the purples and oranges of the background. This also helped to elevate the gun from the background itself. You might be able to see me check the grayscale of the drawing to see if I can figure out where the fudge the gun ends and the building begins without the colors. I don't know if it's just me, but I really love turning the saturation on and off on drawings like this. When the colors come back, they just hit harder suddenly. Or maybe I'm just insane. And one more tip for rendering metal, I use textured brushes. I used these scratch and rake brushes to make it look like metal that has been sanded and or survived many situations but got scratched in the process. I also did this on some of the other metal parts on Boothole, but mostly focused on the gun and his arm since those take up more space on the canvas. It wouldn't really make sense to add this much texture on the arm that's facing away, for example, because the texture would just get lost or become confusing to look at. Plus the gun is a main focal point. I want people to look at it, so I also gotta give them something they can look at, you know? After 5 trillion years of neglecting the back arm, I finally go in to shade it properly. I felt like the whole area back there looked cluttered with the ad sign, hair, cape, and cables going everywhere, to the point it was hard to tell what's going on, so I added a screen layer behind Boothole so it's easier to tell what's still part of him and what's the background. Then I put an orange gradient over his arm so it blends in a bit more again. Maybe it seems a bit counterproductive at first, but once I add the lighting from the ad sign on top, it looks great. It has a solid 3D shape without taking too much attention away from the main focal points of this piece. Then I also add some rim light to the hair and cape, which is honestly so satisfying to do, because it just gives it that extra bit of spice. I also add some stray hairs to his bangs. With that, the most important parts are done now, so it's time for the finishing touches. The gun already looked cool as hell on its own, but what's cooler than a gun? That's right, a smoking gun. I kinda just bullshitted this with the default smoke brush in Procreate and it worked pretty well. Then I wanted to add in some lens flare coming from the ad sign lights. At first I was just gonna grab a picture from Google and slap it in there, but then I decided to make my own lens flare. Let me know if you guys would like to learn more about these little tricks I like to use to finish off my artworks, and I might make a separate video about it in the future. Last but not least is some dust and chromatic aberration and it is complete. You can find prints of this artwork on my imprint. How many hours do you guys think it took to finish this artwork? If you guessed 30, you are correct. This is now the champion for the longest time I spent on a single artwork. Let me know what's your favorite part. Mine has got to be the gun. It just looks so crunchy and edible. If you enjoy watching me draw, here's a video where I redesign some Genshin Impact characters. As always, if you like what I do, you can support me over on Patreon or by leaving a like on this video. Patreons get some extra content though, just saying. Thank you so much for watching. Special thanks to my Patreons. You guys help me keep this channel running. That's it for today. Will out.